Welcome, my friends, back to another guest conversation. Today, I am super excited to be talking to Bridge Kiley. Bridge is a licensed mental health therapist, a consultant, a teacher who I've had the pleasure of working with, and a writer. Welcome, Bridge.
Thanks for having me.
Bridge, tell us a little bit about yourself for people who don't know you. Where do you spend your time, energy, and attention these days? What occupies your attention?
Lots occupying my attention these days, for
Good.
sure.
Yep.
I'm located in the Boston area. Um, so I'm in Northeast United States. So some of my attention was on shoveling my car out, as we were
Indeed.
just talking about from
Yep.
the blizzard that just happened. And During the week, I have a therapy practice. I work in private practice. I work with trainings in IFS. So I'm often working with therapists who are working with the internal family systems model. In my life outside, we have two new people who had entered the family. My sister's due with a baby in a month, and my sister-in-law had a baby in December. So lots of family happenings and yeah, I've been trying to watercolor, have some other ways of using my brain and kind of expressing myself. Yeah, those are a couple ways that I've been spending my time recently.
Beautiful. Congratulations on the growth of your family. That's exciting.
Thanks.
Now, for people who aren't familiar, so you love IFS, I love IFS. What is IFS?
Good question. I feel like what comes out might vary depending depending on the moment when I'm describing it.
Totally.
The title of IFS, like as an acronym, lots of acronyms in the field, but internal
Mm,
family systems is what it stands for. And um, I've heard different things about like the naming of it, how some folks will think it is like your external family system, but the idea is that it's getting to know your internal world, the parts of you that are present, is often kind of how we talk about it, like getting to know the parts of you that show up. So even that idea that we all have different parts of us that make up kind of our internal landscape. I feel like when I started experiencing internal family systems, it was very experiential. So
mm,
I started learning more about it from hearing different folks share and describe various things. I don't even remember how it was described to me initially, but as I was actually practicing it, getting to know parts of me that help me manage or kind of show up in my everyday. It's this idea that we all kind of have a protective system, like parts of us that help us um, with managing our lives, as we
mm,
call them, protectors in internal family systems. And then we all have more exiled parts, as they're called, like parts that hold vulnerabilities. And then we all have a self, like a place inside of us that can be with any of those parts. So it's, yeah, understanding kind of the dynamic internal world and exploring that.
mm. I love that. Understanding the dynamic internal world. I think one of the things that I hear you talking about that I want to kind of open up a little bit because I think it's so powerfully helpful is internal multiplicity and the way that
Mm-hmm.
IFS introduces the idea that um, like we have this kind of assumption, I think, oftentimes, right, for non-IFS practitioners, that like there's a single self and that self goes from situation to situation. And now I'm talking to Bridge, and later I'll make lunch, and then I'll go see a client, and it's this consistent being that's showing up. And my experience with IFS is that it introduces sort of a different way of relating to our experience, which is to say that actually, when I'm talking to Bridge, one part of me shows up. And then when I go pick up my son from school later, no school today because of the snow, but when I go see my son later today, another part of me will come up. And that actually, instead of kind of being this solid unit, we're kind of composed of a constellation of different parts, which is what I think of as the internal family. What are your thoughts on like multiplicity versus sort of this single self, you could say?
Yeah, I think part of what is really kind of like normalizing for people is that you can feel many different ways. Like there's a multiplicity in terms of how we can feel inside. Um, So it definitely resonates. I mean, I would be curious, even just how you would describe IFS, like the word multiplicity and holding multiple complex things to be true, in our internal world. And yeah, I feel like that definitely resonates. And that's part of what appeals to me, like there's not just one way to be or feel. Yeah.
What do you think it is about? Right, because I feel like kind of within ourselves and then also with the clients or the people that we work with, a lot of the suffering comes from kind of like cognitive dissonance, right? Or like an internal tension between different parts of us or different aspects of us that might want very different things.
Mhm.
How do you feel like the language of multiplicity sort of starting to relate to ourselves as this kind of constellation of parts helps with that, helps with the diversity of different experiences we can be having that are sometimes sort of seemingly incongruent. Like what does IFS, how does IFS actually help with that?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm almost even drawn to like give an example
Yeah, totally.
of something where that could be helpful. I don't know, maybe even as I'm talking about like I went to the grocery store for the storm
Yep.
on Sunday. And in going to the grocery store, it was pretty chaotic. And multiple different parts of me came up in that experience. And yeah, I think often when internal family systems is talked about with that idea of multiplicity, like there could be one part of you that wants to do something and another part of you that doesn't, right? So some parts of me said, okay, I want my groceries for the week and want to be prepared for the storm that's coming. And then other parts of me were feeling like I want to stay home. I want to avoid all of
Mm,
that
mm, mm,
chaos of the grocery store, and like even being able to recognize kind of various tensions or different parts of us that are coming up and what they're letting us know. In IFS terms, a lot of times, like this idea of making self-led decisions, like being able to hear from multiple parts of you and what they're kind of describing and being in relationship with your internal world
mm,
is kind of some language that helps me uh even just conceptualize. Like I'm pretty visual, so like, oh
mm.
yeah, like I am being in relationship with various different parts of me that might be here. And there's something that different parts of me, have to offer in terms of the wisdom of what they're holding about that.
Mm, mm.
Yeah.
I love that you named like relationship, right? Because I feel like how we language our experience has so much to do with how we relate to it, right? Like if I'm saying to myself, oh, I'm behaving this way because I'm worthless, that's very different than if I say, oh, I'm behaving this way because I'm really wounded right now or I'm really scared right now. Um,
Hmm.
and at its core, I feel like what we're talking about offers us a different way to relate to the different aspects of our being, right? To the different parts of us. How do you feel like that helps? That sort of looking at them as distinct components rather than one single whole. How does that help us relate better?
Yeah, well, even what you were saying there, like there might be a part that is kind of hard on us, or it has more of like a shaming,
Mm,
voice. Like even just understanding and getting to know where that might be coming from and why, we might have a part that's really coming down on us in a particular way.
mm,
Versus maybe like the softer kind of like, yeah, I'm having a need here.
mm,
You know, I think it helps us kind of, at least if I'm speaking for my own, I don't want to maybe generalize to everyone, but for me and my own experience, it has helped me soften and be able to tune into what I might need in different moments. And, if there's a part of me that's coming down hard on me, not like then fighting,
mm,
but
mm,
actually being able to get curious about that. And it does really, in my own experience, help me attune to my own needs. And using that term, being in relationship with what's going on for me, so that I can show up for what's going on in my life in a way that um, I end up feeling less like I'm in a battle,
mm, mm,
internally.
mm.
Yeah.
That piece around like the battle with yourself feels really important, right? I mean, I think that for me, I find IFS personally, and then with the folks that I work with, has been so helpful in a lot of different areas, but in particular when it comes to, like you said, sort of shame, which I sort of see at the heart of addiction. Um, this way that we can be in conflict with ourselves and we can be really hard on ourselves. How is it that this kind of languaging helps with that? What is it that happens when you kind of identify like, oh, this is a need that I'm having right now?
Mm, good question. I mean, for me personally, I feel like we all have needs, as humans. So I think
Hmm.
what's helpful about it is like
What do you mean?
de-shaming
What are you
the
talking about?
de-shaming,
Hmm.
you know, uh, I guess simply put, like I feel like it's something I know kind of so core to me,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
really saying, yeah, we all have needs, and that not being a problem.
Hmm. So
Uh,
so this is very interesting, right? Like, how is it that we come to learn that having needs is a problem? Because when you just say it like
hmm.
that, it's like, what do you mean? Like, of course we have needs, right? But I think we find in
Yeah.
ourselves and we find with so many people this huge amount of shame for just
Mm,
having needs, for wanting things, for having urges, for needing safety or, satisfaction or whatever. How is it that we learn to relate to ourselves that way?
mm. I mean, it can be such a personal answer.
Mm, mm,
You know, any person that you talk to, I'm sure there's going to be shared similarities in terms of themes, whether it's, systemic issues that hold this message of, some shaming way that, I think globally there can be shared resonance. But this is what I find so fascinating in working with people, like getting to know what the answer to that is. How is it that
mm,
I
mm,
that different parts of me came to learn that what's happening for me is a problem, or that this need that I have is a problem. Um, Again, kind of using that term, like being in relationship with those parts of you that learned that, and the messages that they took on. So, I think on one level, if I'm answering for myself, being on the receiving end of what I'm sure were other parts, but criticism or feeling like some parts of me took on the message that it was wrong, like it's not okay. And, certainly there's stories and experiences that go along with that. Yeah. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, there's so
Yeah.
many. That's the thing is,
Yeah.
I've been encountering as I've been having these conversations with folks. It's interesting just for folks listening. Like, I didn't give you any prompts coming in, right? And we talked
Yeah.
about a little bit before the conversation. Like, is there anything in particular? Like, not really, because
Mhm.
I find that much like in the therapeutic work that we do, when we're having a conversation, it's live. It's in real
Yeah.
time, right? And so there's this sort
Yeah.
of like quantum chaos. Like the conversation could go in any direction. You could share a thought, and then I could approach that in 10 different ways, and then you could respond to that in 10 different ways, right? And so
Hmm.
the conversation kind of has this way of flowing in a kind of unpredictable different way. And like what you were talking about, I think there's so many different, like you could probably write a book about some of the, like we could already write a book about the
Yes.
stuff that we're talking about, right? On
Yeah.
on individual different topics.
Yeah.
Um, but one of the things that I found super interesting was, and I've spoken about this with other colleagues. Um, Sometimes this feeling a little bit that a client or someone will come in with a part that is having a sentiment of like, I'm suffering. Please help me not suffer anymore, which ultimately I think is kind of our work, right? Is to help in whatever way we can ease the suffering of someone who comes into our office. But what you said was really interesting because you said, my role here is not to tell you, hey, this is how you are going to not feel shame around having needs anymore. What you articulated was, let's come to understand how that came to be.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like in the first place, because like you said, it depends on the person in front of us. It depends on the moment, the context, and what you said is like, let's find out how that happened. How is it that we come to relate to ourselves in a way that we punish ourselves when we feel a certain way, or we feel like we need to hide or escape or attack or whatever it is
Hmm.
when there's an emotion or a need moving through us.
Hmm. Yeah. And, even how you were framing that just then, certainly it's been true for me. I know people will come in, like, help me not feel this, right?
Help
Can
me
be,
not feel this.
like what some parts of us are saying. Like, how can I stop feeling this way? Almost is
Mm,
sometimes what
mm,
people are coding to me,
mm,
or help me get out of this feeling or experience. And so, certainly that's an ongoing practice for me, how to have support in actually being with my feelings or my needs, as we're talking about, or the parts of me that want to help me not feel this painful thing,
Mm, mm, mm.
Yeah.
Again, quantum chaos, right? 10 different directions the mind can take. But I
Yes.
think what you're talking about is
Yeah.
so important because
Yeah.
I find that being telegraphed often, right? And not just from clients, also for me when I've been in the client role or when I'm having a hard time and I'm approaching a friend or a therapist or a mentor or whatever it is this subtle flavor that takes on many different shapes, but the core of the flavor is I'm really not enjoying this experience I'm having. Please help me not feel it.
Mm-hmm.
How can I stop feeling this? What's your reaction internally to that sense when you taste that flavor and somebody who's bringing that to you? Like, hey, can you help me not feel this anymore?
Mm-hmm. It really depends on a number of factors. Given how parts of me have been organized, sometimes I can feel like, okay, well, let me fix something, or like,
Mm.
how do I, even what folks will talk about when they're like even learning a new therapeutic approach or how to kind of like be with someone in something is like, what are the right steps? How do I help here? Like, what
Ah,
do I do? Almost like joining with those parts can sometimes be an impulse that parts of me have, depending on, especially if like I resonate with my own parts might want to like help someone not feel that pain. I feel like when I'm really kind of connected to myself, I can see the good intention of those parts that are trying to help with something that is really painful. So I think just really, hearing that as this thing is really hard for me. Um, and feeling some compassion and curiosity about that, when I'm in the best of moments, I think is the direction that I go. Again, I know we're speaking like pretty globally, so I think it really does depend kind of like on how that's flowing in the moment. But I'm typically not like thinking, like I'm really just feeling and in connection with, even in like my own uh, experience of parts that might want to like stay away from something, so to speak.
what are you talking about? I
Um,
don't know what you're talking about.
yeah. But I think your question was, about how do I respond to that kind of in a moment. Most of the time, I just hope that it's authentic and it feels really kind of caring for, whatever the context or the thing that the person is presenting about that.
What's coming up for me now is, kind of how we approach suffering culturally, right? And there have been so many different ways of conceptualizing of suffering through the religious lens or the spiritual lens, through the medical lens, through so many different ways that we can conceptualize of it. And then that's important because that sort of determines how we approach it, right? Like what are the methods that we're going to use, internal or external, to be able to address our suffering and its causes. And we live in a culture right now where a predominant method of understanding suffering and addressing it is through the conceptual mind, right? It's sort of like cognitively, there's something malfunctioning in this area of the
Mm.
body and something about the way the neurons are firing that is making you have unhappy feelings. And so we're going to use sort of systematic methods to be able to bring you out of that experience. There is, I think, the way that maybe you and I practice a little bit more, which has a very different view. It doesn't say that the conceptual mind is not important. Obviously, it's important to think about things in the right way or in helpful ways. But what you're describing is something very different as I hear it is like, how can I be present with this person and how can I use my own internal system, my own feelings that I'm having to inform the way that I'm interacting with this person in a way that's actually helpful to this person that's come before me. And something that's really interesting that you described is that oftentimes, and this is my experience, I wonder what your experience is that like oftentimes the people who trigger me the most that I'm working with my clients or some whatever that is, right? Whether it's like excitement or sadness or terror or whatever it is, are expressing parts that I within myself carry that I still have some healing to do around or some work to do with. And there's a way in which one of the reasons why I love this practice from the practitioner perspective is that it's as much about us in the moment and being aware of our own system as we're interacting with somebody, as it is about sort of doing something to a person who comes in and
Mhm.
says, "Hey, I'm having this sad feeling. Can you make it go away?" What's
Mhm.
your experience with that? Sort of the practice from the seat of, the therapist, or there are non-therapist practitioners of IFS.
Yeah, I mean, something that I just feel like yes to everything you just described. And then it's something that has really, I know, been so present, especially through like the intensity of this moment that we're living through, is how much we all need each other,
Mm,
So to not, even what you just described, of not feeling like I'm doing something to you or I'm helping you solve what is like a problem here. And I think that's often a really important message that I certainly need and I know has come up in a lot in my connection with other people, that you're not like a problem to be solved.
mm, mm,
We're not like finding the thing that's wrong with you. Um, and I, like you said, I feel like there's a couple of different threads that I could follow. Just going back to what you were saying about like conceptually or kind of cognitively understanding something, I've really been in a process of like how to feel like I'm using both my head and my heart.
mm,
And yeah, in moments where it feels like I'm trying to like solution or like figure something out, I think it does pull me away from that connection. And I do just think being in connection is such an important need. uh, Going back to needs. So feeling like you're in connection with a real human person is also something that I feel like is so important therapeutically. And, that's certainly something that's resonated. What I was saying earlier about experiencing IFS being part of why it's a kind of clinical home for me, so to speak, in terms of the approach that I use, is because
mm,
I also, work with my own system and my own parts. It's not like something out here,
mm,
like this is good for other people,
mm,
but
mm,
I'm not
mm.
applying it for myself.
Sometimes I'll ask questions that seem silly, but often I find that they yield very deep answers, right? So like, so you said something that just kind of stuck with me. It's like what you said, something to the effect of like the work that we're doing is about connecting with a real person, or offering somebody a real person to connect with. Why is that important? What is it that
Hmm.
that does to a person when they feel real connection with a real person?
Hmm. I keep being drawn to respond to these questions just like with the like, oh wow, like let me take a second with that.
Take your time.
What is my answer to
Mm,
what's important about connection with a real person?
mm,
Um, sometimes there are sort of like broad sentiments that I feel like, depending on the spirit that they're set in, can feel authentic or not. But the sentiment that comes across my mind at this point in time is the phrase like we can hurt in relationship and we can also heal in
mm.
relationship. And I don't really know. I think my logical mind wants to answer, but like
Ah.
my it just wants to say connection is just important. And
Mm,
I just know that, right?
mm,
Like it's hard for me to actually come up with a
mm.
like, why is that so important? Yeah, I just know deeply that it is.
I love that we're noticing how different it is to like mediate relationship through the thinking mind versus through the feeling body.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's really helpful about the conceptual mind is that it can give us something to hold on to. Right? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
ooh, this and that, and Bridge is over there, and I'm over here, and this is happening, and that's, and kind of really good at analyzing and breaking down and cutting up into separate little bits. But I think what we find is that the healing sometimes exists at a level that's much deeper than that, difficult to sort of put words to. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it made me think
Yeah.
of my Tibetan teachers. So I practice Tibetan Buddhism, and I have teachers who talk about samsara, right? The cyclic suffering of existence as not being caused by the thinking mind, but that the thinking mind is samsara. Like,
Mm.
it's not that this generates a state of dissonance and distress and suffering. It's that when we're locked in, I'm remembering when you said like we're not here to find what's wrong with you, right? If I'm spending all my time trying to figure out what's wrong with me, how do I fix this, how do I fix my life, when life becomes a problem to solve through the mind rather than an experience to move through the intuition and connection with the body. Those are two very different ways of relating to reality, right?
Yeah. And I mean, they both have a place, right? Like they both can support us in different ways. Yeah.
How do we integrate those two?
These are great questions.
I'm recording, so.
How do we integrate those two? I mean, I can, again, I think answer for myself that
Mm,
that is an ongoing question, like how to integrate the both of those, even in, for example, like my creative process.
mm,
I feel like that's been a big exploration. Like, how do I integrate the, and I mean, this was even something I was like writing in my notebook as a question, you know, like the parts of me that are maybe more like pragmatic or like understand and like making meaning, making sense of things versus like just the like what emerges when I'm kind of letting something flow and with the feeling of what wants to kind of come out on the page. Yeah, allowing space for both and uh that there's room for both of those ways of being in touch and expressing. Again, I think that is such a like, what does that look like for each person? Um, and sometimes when there is such an overemphasis on like, I need to like intellectually kind of like make sense of that,
mm.
there might be a need for more support to kind of drop into the felt sense. Or sometimes when there's like a lot of feeling and you want help with like understanding or orienting to that, like that kind of balance can be helpful.
This is great. This is why I'm coming to like really trust the chaos.
Yeah.
This is making me think about polarizations, right? Which is something that we talk a lot about in
Yeah.
IFS, which is essentially when there are different parts of us that want different things and enter into conflict with one another. So at the heart of addiction and addictive processes, oftentimes, and wonderful practitioner Martha Sweezy, Nancy Sowell, at the heart of those processes, oftentimes is essentially a part that says, I really want to do this thing because it eases my pain in the moment and it feels good. And this other part that says we cannot do this thing because it's going to cause harm to ourselves or the people in our lives. And so much of the suffering of addiction is sometimes maybe not so much about the behavior. Sometimes it is about the behavior and we have to sort of mitigate harm. But oftentimes it's the energy expended in that conflict, right? That polarization when two parts are kind of at war with one another. And as we're talking, I feel like we're stumbling into like a huge core polarization in our culture and within ourselves, which is like the mind and the heart, right? Like the Cartesian divide, like we are either thinking our way through the experience or we are feeling our way through experience. How do you, and you said, yep, like this is coming up for me in my creative stuff and in all sorts of different areas. Like, what do you find helpful in your experience as you sit with these questions and you work through this polarization in finding integration between the thinking mind and what's good and helpful about it and the feeling heart or the feeling body and what's good and helpful about it?
Yeah, I feel like even just talking about it, like sharing, finding resonance with other people, exploring. I've just been recently in a writing course where there's various different like mini exercises, kind of like practicing with different frameworks. So the way that this writing course is set up is it's basically like 10 sessions and different people are brought in as kind of guest presenters who are talking about various different ways of like knowing or relating
Mm,
to things. So one like was an automatic writing process.
mm,
So I feel like practicing,
mm,
and connection with others and experimenting, like, oh, I can explore how this shows up for me. And, one thing in my own like sharing and getting support around my relationship with creativity has really been about unfearing my creativity and like
mm,
exploring those edges and getting to know how that shows up for me. Even as we're having this conversation, I feel like the questions that you're posing of like, how do you relate to this or how are you understanding this? Like being in dialogue with myself about that
mm,
and letting it continue to evolve. Yeah, I mean, I also really love self-compassion practice.
Mm.
So I do feel like ultimately like finding a compassionate place inside myself where I can experiment and explore and share with others also really does, and has been helpful. And hopefully will continue to
Mm.
happen.
Mm.
Similarly, though, I feel like I could probably answer in like a lot of different threads, but I almost feel drawn to like ask you back the question.
You can ask the questions.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm here
yeah.
for it.
So I am curious for you too, how you would answer that.
Which question? I've lost track. We're talking about a lot of different things. What's, yeah,
Yeah,
what are you curious for?
yeah. About, kind of working with that polarization of feeling like what your mind might hold and, like bridging the two and integrating, in a way, especially in like creativity. That's
Totally.
something I'm very curious about these days. Yeah.
I mean, I think that what immediately comes to my mind is one of my teachers, one of my dear, dear teachers, Tom, who talks about like sitting with the questions rather than chasing the answers.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were talking, the word that stood out for me and the thing that's really at the heart of like my life and this channel is practice and all the
Mm-hmm.
different kinds of practice and how I think about if I step back and I go like what is contemplative practice all about for me in my experience? And I think it's all about supporting me in sitting with the questions, the feelings, the thoughts without needing to resolve them. Like without
Mm-hmm.
needing to have a neat conclusion that says, oh, things are actually this way, because I have found that there is no faster way to close our minds and
Mm-hmm.
prevent the possibility of learning and growing and developing and humility than when the mind says, I got it. Like I figured it out.
Uh-huh.
I got the thing.
Yeah.
And so I think that at the heart of a lot of this, creative practices too, right? Not just contemplative practices, creative practices for me are about like relaxing the need to control, relaxing the need to solidify in a conclusive way and to support my capacity for engaging fully in what's arising in the moment, um, which is really, really hard to do. And I think what was coming up for me is as I was hearing you and in this conversation is just like this is not a new conversation. This is like
Mm-hmm.
the history of humans is figuring out how do we fucking reconcile these like really intelligent brains that really know how to cut things apart, but with these really like wise and sensitive bodies that are in a much more like direct relationship with the world around us, right? Because I can think, oh no, there's a car coming at me, but that's not going to hurt my body, right? But if a car hits me, then my body is suffering, right? So there's a way in which I think the body is in much more immediate relationship with the world around us, and that terrifies us. And I think the processes of the mind try to create some buffer, try to create some separation between the immediacy of like how little we know and how like vulnerable we are to other people and to the world around us. And, methodologies like IFS, I love IFS, but methodologies like IFS are eventually bound to become historical artifacts, right? They sort of move and change and evolve. And, maybe 30 years from now, people will still be practicing IFS, probably not in the same way as they do now. In 100 years, like it'll be different. But I think one of the things that, or the way that I view it, and I'm really interested in talking to other IFS practitioners about this, is like the way that I experience one of the greatest values of this method or this approach is that it kind of sets the tone as I experience it for something like contemporary non-dual methodology modality,
Mm-hmm.
where we're actually able to hold all the different aspects of our experience with compassion and without needing to like fix them or control them or have an answer to them. And so yeah, I'm just sort of really noticing the like the historical context of the conversation we're having now and how long people have been struggling to find the answers or the ways to live in the truth that it seems that it's really difficult to integrate the experience of being in a body and living in the physical world with the simultaneous capacity of being like symbolic beings, right? Like having the capacity for abstract, imaginal thinking. Um, and as a Buddhist practitioner, so much of the work is kind of like trying to bring those two together, right? It's like, how do I actually bring my imagination down to the point where it's not that I mean, it's so imagination is so important, but that it's sort of is harmonizing, it's synchronizing with the truth of the world around me as fully as I can know it. And that's a process that, because our ignorance is infinite, it's like it's sort of it's a daily cultivation, right? And things like contemplative practice and creative practices really, in my experience, are um, the greatest resource we have in that process. And like I think making it relational, right? Like having these conversations and making the whole process of inquiry and discovery something that is done collectively and that connects us rather than isolates us further into like our own individual ideas of how things
Mhm.
are and why they might be that way.
Going back to the theme of connection. Yeah.
You talked about earlier, I asked you at the beginning of the conversation, um, how is it that we come to feel shame around having needs, right? And you said, well, there's like systemic causes for that, the different relational systems we're embedded in. When you look at the state of human connection these days, what's your assessment of it? And how did we get to this place, in your opinion?
Hmm. When I look at the state of human connection these days,
Yeah.
what's my assessment of it?
Yeah. How are we doing as connective creatures?
Yeah, I mean, my mind references many different touch points about like the isolation and
Hmm.
loneliness and disconnection and polarization. Insert many different words that kind of say we're not doing so great on that front. Um, yeah, and then the second piece of how did we get here? Um, I do feel like what you're saying about how things will evolve over time and what we need in any given moment. Certainly, I feel like, looking ahead to like how is what I'm doing right now going to impact 7 generations from now? Like that
Mm,
question always really
mm,
appeals to me,
mm,
you know. And I think if, I look back and start understanding what's happened in the last number of generations, it does make sense to me how we got here.
mm.
And also, I do feel like we're really living the trauma of the pandemic. It's wild to me that it's been 6 years since the
Totally.
pandemic.
6 years into a 2 week process, right?
Yeah. Yeah, let's see. I guess I'm asking myself, like, what is it that I want to say about that? Yeah, I feel like there are simultaneously things that are so disheartening and also things that are so uh, heart opening at the same time. And that's part of the intensity, I feel like, of
Mm,
this moment that I can like simultaneously feel both.
mm.
Um,
Say more about that. Say more, because I resonate super hard with that, right? Like the issue is not so much that things are terrible, it's that some things are really terrible, and some things seem really full of hope and possibility.
mhm,
How do we hold
mhm,
both? How do you hold both?
hmm, hmm. This is where I feel like the multiplicity, like holding many
Mm,
things to be true, can be very helpful. Um, I mean, sometimes it feels like I'm holding one more than another.
mm,
And I feel like it's especially, like living through the past year, like one question of how do I really care for myself, hold things that feel hopeful, resource me, give me the supports to like meet the moment and show up and stay connected, especially when I feel like there's a lot in one hand, so to speak. And, like I want to hold both, like what helps support making room for both. That to go back to what you said, like posing the question, I think is almost more important, like just kind of inviting that question ongoingly and feeling like I'm continuing to answer that. Because there's so much that is happening that informs, like, how do I hold all that's here? I know maybe I'm answering kind of vaguely, but
I went on
Yeah.
like a 5 minute ramble, so we're doing great. I think we're doing great.
Okay.
I'm drawn to
Uh,
this sense of like, oh gosh, this is such an abstract question, maybe, but like you and I have talked about today, and oftentimes in contemplative spaces, we'll talk about like holding experience, holding. Oh,
mhm,
like how do you hold that? How do you? And if you give me a burrito, now I'm holding a burrito. I go, yes, I'm
mm,
holding it right there. Like,
uh-huh.
what do we mean when we say holding experience? Like, what does that actually mean? How do we help ourselves hold things better? It kind of confuses a part of my mind, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, what is it that's holding what? Where's it being held? Like, why does it need to be held? What does that mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like allowing it to be there. I mean, yeah, you probably use the same example of like, hey, I'm here with you to go back to connection. You're holding the burrito. Like I've got kind of a grasp on it. Like I can see it. I
Mm,
can be in relationship with it, to use that phrase again.
mm, mm,
Um, yeah, to bring it into some form of consciousness.
mm. Wow, this to me, this is striking me as very deep. Like there's a way in which like I kind of need the burrito to hold the burrito in order for it to be real to me.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think
Mm-hmm.
like in relationship, what we're talking about when we hold each other is like we're reminding each other that we're real in that moment, right? Like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
someone is perceiving you and responding to you. You are in an intelligent universe that senses your presence and responds to your existence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I find that so much childhood trauma and neglect and harm, actually, that's kind of at the heart of it, right? Is when a
Mm,
child or a person learns either the universe doesn't see me, I don't exist, I'm not important, it doesn't respond to me, or if I make myself known in any way, the universe harms me, the people around me
mm,
hurt me.
mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, one, sometimes I think of different like acronyms. One thing that comes to my mind, Leslie Petrick is a trainer that I've worked with before. She uses the SHOVE acronym:
Hmm.
seen, heard, understood, and validated. And I think I kind of added to that saying like we want to be the opposite of shoved away. Like we do it, there is a core need to be seen, heard, understood, and validated, and experiences that, I think this is part of that concept of like things being exiled, is that they're like pushed away, told that they can't exist. And so how to really hold something and embrace and welcome it in, and to feel welcomed.
Hmm.
That is part of, yeah, continuing to evolve as people.
You
Yeah.
used that, this is bringing me back to, we talked about the different parts of us, and then you mentioned self, and if we have time, I want us to
Mm,
dig into that a little bit, but there are, in the IFS view, like categories of parts, right? These protective parts that come in and do different jobs in different ways, and or hold experience, I guess you could say, in different ways. And one of them is exiles, exile parts.
mhm.
What is an exile, and how does it fit within the context of IFS, and why is it important to know about and know how to work with?
Mm. Yeah. Well, I guess maybe starting with the protective parts, what are called managers and firefighters. And, I think some parts of me feel like the words or them being proactive or reactive only matters in the sense of like understanding more about like when they come in or what they're trying to do. And those parts of us often are trying to protect parts of us that carry some pain or some message, some belief, some feeling. So those parts that kind of get pushed away are what exiles are, and kind of in the IFS framework. And I think, there's so many, this is my conceptualization of
Yeah.
it. There's so many different ways to kind of describe it. But a lot of times, people will see them as like younger parts or experiences that are carrying some belief, experience, meaning made. And so the idea in IFS therapy to be able to go to those parts and help them unload whatever burden they're carrying, is some of how like it's conceptualized. And then, I do, one of the things that I really like about this approach to the point that I feel like we were speaking about earlier is that there's not like one rigid way to understand that. So you kind of get to know and understand your own parts and how your system experiences those through, the process of learning and understanding them. So a lot of my own exiled parts have been younger parts of me. And I think, to maybe the point of what I was saying earlier, like that idea of like something that's been shut down or pushed away or, shoved to the side, right? And I do think there's a distinction between like those parts are not the burdens that they carry.
Mm.
So, like using an example of like a part of me that believes that I'm not good enough, for example. There's the idea that that part kind of can carry that belief, and you can free up the part that's carrying that in getting to know it and it not being exiled anymore.
Mm.
How would you describe exiles?
Oh, don't get me started.
Okay.
Maybe I'll share a thought about that.
Okay.
I want to kind of keep following a curiosity I have and hear from you because, we talked about earlier how, there's so many different ways of conceptualizing of suffering, and that's mediated through like cultural understanding, linguistic, language, scientific development, worldview, all those different things. And I think that different human suffering is human suffering, but our ways of understanding it are different. And so if you think about like what this is making me think about and Exiles bring up for me a lot is a reflection on like the unconscious. And
Mm.
like Freud talked about the id, the ego, the superego, the different layers of awareness, those we have direct access to and those we don't, that show up in dream states or altered states. Jung talked about like the shadow realm, right, of like the aspects of us that are operating through us, but that are doing that without our conscious awareness. And I often experience Exiles, and a lot of the work of the IFS approach being to sort of unearth exiles, right? Like oftentimes the first step isn't even like helping these parts unburden. It's even becoming aware
Mm-hmm.
of what these parts are, where they live, how they operate. And oftentimes the way
Mm-hmm.
to do that in IFS, we use the name trailheads, is the protectors, right? The managers, the firefighters that are either like proactively like presenting themselves in a certain way or using the Google Calendar so they're never late and don't get judged, or like using, alcohol to help numb pain in a more kind of reactive way. And often it's like those parts kind of wrap around the true issue, which is like these wounds that kind of like distort. Like if I think about this as like kind of gruesome, right? But I brought this up in a previous conversation. It's like if I'm walking down the street and somebody stabs me with a knife, all of my attention and all of my bodily experience now is going to contract around this point in a way that it was not contracted before. And then if I keep trying to walk, I'll probably walk hunched over, holding my belly, being like, oh my God, and there's this pain there. And if I don't know that there's pain there or what caused it, then I can't go to the hospital, right? I can't actually have somebody bring attention to it so I can learn to walk in a way that doesn't organize itself around that pain. And I think that the way that these exiles work oftentimes is that we experience these wounds, we kind of crunch over, and because they're either like really chronic or they happen when we're really young, they become a part of our identity. We don't
Mm-hmm.
even recognize that they're there anymore. And a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
work that we're doing is uncovering the nature of the wound, not so we can change what happened because we can't do that, but so that we can actually bring, which I think ultimately is always like some form of like being in relationship in a way that heals, the proper antidotes or the proper remedy to actually heal that wound at the entry point. And I guess my question for you is like why, like that seems to be a psychic process. That seems to be a psychological mechanism in humans that when experience is like too overwhelming or too painful to make sense of or to integrate in some way, we kind of take it and we clunk, cut it off and put it into we store it in the unconscious mind. And it's not that those feelings go away, it's that our direct conscious contact with those experiences go away. What do you think of that idea? Like, is that something that you resonate with? And like, if so, why do our minds do that? Like, why do exiles become exiles in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe I'll say a little bit more about just even how I got into therapy and doing therapeutic work. My maternal grandmother was a body-centered psychotherapist and became one a little bit later in her life with my step grandfather. And, they really, sometimes the languages or things that I reference talking about like learning through a relationship does come through things that I've learned from them. And so I feel like understanding that, what you were just describing, like we're all kind of organized internally in a way that is trying to keep us safe, right? And that idea that parts of us feel like it's not safe, this idea that our protectors might have this motto, like, never again do I want to be hurt in that way. It definitely resonates for me, that idea of like, hey, I'm going to organize myself in this way to keep from that hurt happening again. Like, to use your example, some parts of you might go, I'm never walking down that street again, right? Because I got stabbed there, right? Or, something along those lines. And so part of why I gave the reference to my grandparents is that I feel like they really embodied for me some of the, like, having the supports to be able to address those, things that got kind of like pushed away, it feeling like it's possible that you have enough like access to yourself or supports in your life to be able to, have a reparative experience or kind of like integrate something that happened that was, so painful. And I think this is where it can be really challenging as a human, how things are set up. Like a lot of times there aren't the supports to be able to, and our hearts are doing their best to kind of manage within the conditions that are there. And this, even having the support to be able to, see that some things might be locked away or pushed away. I'm not really sure why it is that we're organized that way. It's a good question. But it certainly feels resonant for me. And, and so many people that I've worked with, there is this like locked away, or I can't look at that, or like that's over here, or like I can't go there, or I need to keep from feeling that kind of response. So I think it is such a human kind of protective thing, and the reasons for why that is, or kind of how we've organized in that way, I think has a lot to do with our experiences in the world, a lot to do with the messages and the conditions of our life, and, can be pretty person, experience, environment specific in various different ways. But that's some of how I've come to kind of conceptualize that.
That's really interesting what you just said, and I think we've talked about a lot about the great things about IFS. One of the limitations that I have encountered, or one of the things that I sit with as a practitioner, is that let's stay with the analogy of being stabbed, right? Like, and we talked about sort of in doing IFS, the goal is to bring awareness to the system, develop our capacity for what's called like the 8 C's. Now it's the 9 C's, right? Like compassion, curiosity, connectedness, clarity, all of that stuff. And if along the way we can experience what we call an unburdening, right? Being able to like identify core wounds, core beliefs, core emotions, memories that we organize ourselves around, right? That's sort of identifying the core wound and then being able to like suck out the poison in a sense and then kind of close it over and do that well. That's really beautiful when that happens. It doesn't always happen in that way. But and I think this maybe has less to do with IFS and more about a certain cultural bias that we have in healing arts generally, right? Or in behavioral mental health, which is that we're going to heal you at an individual level. Unless you're like a family therapist or you do kind of systems work, like it's, you're an individual, you come and you see me, and together one-on-one, we're going to help heal those wounds for you. There's this very sort of individualized approach to the healing process. And one of the things that brings up for me about, the protectiveness of these parts, I love what you said, right? So why does this happen? And you said, well, basically, as I see it, it kind of has to do with how we organize ourselves internally. And one of the core ways we organize ourselves is to establish and maintain safety, physical safety, psychological safety, relational, emotional safety, and that messaging. So that kind of was like, I just like felt that in my body, like, oh, never again do I want to experience that kind of suffering, that kind of particular suffering. And so it gives rise to all of these patterns of aversion and avoidance that can have all of these different consequences in our lives as we continuously organize ourselves around a threat that is potentially no longer there. But what I want to talk about is like, what happens when the threat still is there? right? So what
Hmm.
happens if I actually am still unsafe emotionally to walk out into the street? This gets into a conversation about how different bodies of different shapes and sizes and backgrounds and colors and genders experience society and experience the world differently and are
Hmm.
subject to different types of danger that other kinds of bodies might not be subject to.
Hmm.
And so, how do we kind of balance that truth that, like, yes, we want to heal our wounds, and there are ways in which we close ourselves off from the world and protect ourselves, but there are ways in which the world really is actually unsafe. Like maybe I
Hmm.
should not walk down that street, right? Because
Hmm.
there are people wielding knives that want to hurt me down that street.
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
how do we how do you find that you tread that ground with people to kind of make it more concrete? Or, if it's like, if I'm in an emotionally abusive relationship, right? I may not want to necessarily go, oh, like I'm unburdened now. And like I trust the world because my immediate relational world is actually untrustworthy. And so it's really
Hmm.
important that I do keep myself safe or I do keep my
Hmm.
children safe.
Hmm.
What do you think of that? What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I'm first drawn to talk about is this idea of like ourself, and that a couple things, our parts have wisdom, right? Attuning to and listening to what our parts are letting us know about is really important. And then I've had so many different conversations with folks over time about like not defining what kind of like self energy is, and this idea that like, oh, I just trust what you just said, right? Like, oh, I just trust and I'm going to be open all the time, right? Like, we need to, this is something that's been said that really resonates. Sometimes we do need to close, and parts of us are helping inform like what's needed in different moments. So what does being connected to yourself look like? That I feel like is such a important conversation, that it doesn't just look like always, when people say like, oh, I'm just calm, right? Not like you're going to need to have different responses or different ways of showing up. um, there was something that was, again, kind of speaking like for my own personal experience. I feel like, a couple of years back, something was said about anxiety and like parts of us that might be frightened or worried, and how that's not like pathological in terms of things that are happening that parts of us are worried about or frightening, and kind of attuning to that. How I see that is we don't heal in isolation, right? This is where I think, therapy not being seen as like the end all be all, like individual therapy, like providing everything that you need in that context. And this is where I do feel like being collaborative in conversation, like what is the context of what someone is living? And, really that idea that if we can attune to what your parts are letting you know and be in relationship with them, it does kind of inform that question of what am I needing? And I think brings us back to what we were talking about early on. Like that is such an important question to be asking, like what's needed here, and not having a one size fits all approach to that. The
Mm,
context of what someone is living, the like if I'm using more like clinical, like external constraints, or like what's bringing someone in terms of what they're wanting to work on in therapy. It's not a okay, this will all be solved if we just unburden a part of you, and that's that, right? It's much
mm,
more kind
mm,
of layered and dynamic than that. And it would definitely be a misrepresentation on my end if someone came in and I said everything will be healed just through, us meeting individually and working on this. But,
mm,
I do really think in order to be able to face and be present for what's happening, we want you to hopefully feel more connection to yourself, that you're more in tune with the wisdom of what parts of you are letting you know. And that will hopefully also inform, what you might need or what's needed.
mm,
Yeah, I think similar to, as we've said in this conversation, many different directions I could go with what I'm saying or describing there, but it's a good and important question, and I think how someone's responding to, especially like when there's some imminent threat or something happening in front of them, they'd be responded to differently.
mm.
Um, so,
So, I think we could keep this conversation going. I think maybe kind of some closing thought as we wind down, like, you've talked about, I love what you said, right? So our parts have wisdom. And sometimes there's a little bit of this flavor that has like a little colonial taste to it, a little bit in IFS conceptualizing of like we're going to find this part and we're going to unburden it.
Mhm.
And I think he says something really important, right? Like the burdens are not the parts. Like we don't want to get rid of this part, right? I
Mhm.
don't want to get rid of my anxiety, even though, as we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, oftentimes there's a subtle motive of like, please help me not feel this way. And oftentimes we feel that way. Hey, I would really love to not feel this way. Um, and there's a little bit of a flavor sometimes that I pick up on that, like you can either be in self, you can be self-connected, or you can be blended with a part. That's what we say in IFS, right? You're
Mhm.
blended. Um, so being blended with anger might be like taking something and throwing it at you. And if I'm able to unblend a little bit, maybe I'm still angry, but I say, hey, Bridge, I'm really angry with you right now. It's a very different way of responding to anger, right? But something we don't talk enough about, I think, is how do we be with parts as they're present, sort of self-connected parts, if that makes sense, right? Where I can actually listen to the wisdom of what this part is telling me right now. And this has a lot to do with something you've mentioned a number of times today, self and self energy. Um, so just in closing, what there's nothing close. This is a whole different conversation. Um, for folks who are listening, and maybe you come back on the show sometime, what is self, and why is it important to cultivate self connection, self leadership in the context of all the things that we've talked about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. I was just in a training where someone shared, there's like the 8 C's of self, but I really think like defining for yourself that question, what does it feel like when you're connected to yourself is really important. And someone had shared, I think I could even pull it up. It was like 7 B's from an indigenous IFS like framework. And one was belly laughter, which I loved. Um, and inspired by, let's see. Okay, here it is. I mean, there's so many different ways that it could be, and it's such like a personal exploration. Like even that question, like I want to pose that to someone and not tell them, kind of to the spirit of what we were
Hmm.
saying earlier. Yeah, belly laughter is one. The right to be and belong, balance, embodied learning, ceremony as a type of unburdening, blessing, recognizing that all life is sacred. So, yeah, like there's so many, that question of like, what does it mean to feel connected to yourself? I feel like that's such an important question, and what helps you be in connection with yourself and in relationship with the parts of you that are here. I mean, that's kind of like at the core of my work, right? And the core of my exploration, just as a person. And yeah, the language could vary, kind of like the semantics could vary.
Hmm.
And I think for me, when I'm feeling connected to myself, there is something that I couldn't even put into words, like that I couldn't even describe. And it is such a felt sense of what that feels like. And it does really feel like, like okay, I can be with this,
Hmm.
and there's not something wrong here.
Hmm.
Which, talk to me tomorrow. I might say it slightly differently, but yeah, that's what's coming out today and
Beautiful.
in this moment. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bridge. We could keep going, but I think for today, let's bring it to a close. Thanks so much for sharing your wisdom, sharing your medicine, your thoughts, and making the time. I appreciate you.
Yeah. Thank you for all the time. And it's so good to be in conversation with you. Yeah.
Likewise.